Howdy everybody, Coach Highway from GameLeap here, and in this video today we're going to be covering Ashe and the tricks I've used to get to GM with her. If you're unfamiliar with me, I actually used Ashe to get to GM with a 100% win rate, so these tricks and tips I'll be giving you are going to be the exact ones that I used when I made that video. Before we get into it, you should 100% check out our new website. I've been working with the other coaches to crank out some really amazing content that will give you far more detail and help than any of the stuff we put out on our YouTube. Be sure to give it a look by clicking on this link here. Okay, so back to Ashe. First and foremost, the immediate thing you'll need to do on Ashe is configure your scoped sensitivity. To find the option, go to your escape menu and then your options tab, and then where you can select specific heroes on the right, head over to Ashe. From here, you'll see a scope sensitivity option. For some, it's preferred to use a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that your sensitivity feels the same when you scope in, since your field of view changes. Some folks who are smarter than I am with math have figured out that the number used to maintain a 1-to-1 is 51.47 for Ashe. That's 51.47. That being said, I personally have found the 1-to-1 to be intrusive for my aim when I'm having to do a quick adjustment flick, so I end up usually using a higher sensitivity at around 62. Experiment a bit with it and see what suits you best, but changing your scope sense has the capacity to make Ashe a much more comfortable hero to play on. Moving on, let's talk about Ashe's perfect range and what sort of positions you're going to want to play with her. The best range for Ashe is somewhere in the mid-range, closer than you would expect a Widow to play, but farther than a Tracer or a Reaper. This range prevents Ashe's weapon from having damage fall off from being too far away, and makes your shots easier without having to be precise with an enemy who is right up in your face, and thus hard to hit. Furthermore, you're going to want to use her shotgun ability to blast yourself up to high grounds to make it more difficult for some members of the cast to reach you and push you out, as well as give you a nice sightline into the enemy backline past their tank. The more aggressive you can play without being pushed, the better. You want to be a constant force of pressure for the enemy to be concerned about, and make them spend a lot of time trying to figure out a way to knock you off of your perch. This, however, can be very different if the enemy is running a Widow or a Hanzo. In these cases, you should be playing closer to a shield if you have one, which may oftentimes be on the low ground, or you want to make sure wherever you are holding has plenty of natural cover like boxes and walls to make it more difficult for the enemy sniper to get an easy headshot on you. All in all, just look for your safest mid-range bet that is still able to see the frontline fight, and your position should mostly be good. Let's cover some basics about Ashe's gun and her various cooldowns one at a time. Starting with her weapon, you may find yourself often asking if it's better to use her fast fire rate hip fire shots with reduced damage, or her slow fire rate high damage scope shots. There are really two questions I ask myself when I am trying to figure this out. Question number one is, how important is my movement? This is important because when scoped, Ashe moves in such a straighter line and at a slower speed, meaning that she is far easier to hit. If you're going against something like a Genji or a Cassidy who gets the drop on you, using your strafe keys to throw off their aim while peppering them with your hipfire is actually a great way to try to turn the fight in your favor. This can surprise them as they may have been anticipating for you to scope in, and when you simply don't, they now have to react and hit a much harder shot on you. If you keep enemy reloads in mind as well, you can mix scope shots in with your unscoped. For example, as Tracer starts to get to the end of her clip, you can scope in and go for a high damage shot on her since she won't be able to damage you while she reloads anyway. All in all, keeping myself alive in dangerous duels or escaping something like a tank are my main reasons for whether or not I use my unscoped fire over my scoped fire. For the second question that I ask myself, is my target low HP? This one is much more straightforward. With a high fire rate, you have a easier time landing at least one needed shot to finish off a low HP enemy. This makes her unscoped fire preferable since you can spam it and secure those kills much more often. Once you're really good, you can actually start weaving your unscoped shots with your scoped headshots in order to quickly burst down enemy targets before they can react. That's really all that's needed to cover her weapon. It's otherwise a simple point-and-click hit scan gun that has high amounts of damage. This also makes Ashe an effective Pharah counter. Before we go on to her cooldowns, are you enjoying the video so far? If so, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, back to it. First up for Ashe's cooldown is her Coach Gun, and her Coach Gun provides her with a serious amount of mobility. It can also be used to knock enemies back away from Ashe, providing her with an increased amount of distancing and also potentially lining herself up for easy shots. It has a fairly long cooldown, however, so be sure to be sparing with it and only use it when you have time to set up in a position or when you desperately need to avoid being jumped on. It also does some damage, but that's overall a very small and otherwise insignificant factor when compared to the other utility it provides. The next ability for Ashe is Dynamite, and it's key to Ashe's dueling and her ult charge. There are two main ways to use it based on what kind of team the enemy has. Against a dive high mobility team, save your Dynamite for dueling DPSs or for finishing off kills. Because of Dive's inherent mobility and split nature, it can be hard to land a fat Dynamite on a bunch of targets, and you'll find more consistent and helpful value having it to get easy free damage on those hard to hit heroes like Tracer or Genji. It's also worth noting that because it's an explosion, you can detonate it on Genjis while they reflect, so long as you don't throw the dynamite right onto the Genji. Against a slower or generally more stacked team, your dynamite is an amazing damage dealing tool. You simply line it up to hit as many enemies as possible, such as when they are crossing through a choke. This makes her dynamite useful in a variety of situations, but as long as the enemy team doesn't have any divers or targets you feel you really need to save the dynamite for in order to beat in the 1v1, you should always be using it to quickly charge up your ultimate from the damage it deals. This proves to be vital, as against these teams, Bob is a very powerful ultimate when placed correctly, and can absolutely dictate whether or not you hard carry a game on Ashe. However, something very important to keep in mind: do not spam your dynamite randomly against a stacked team when you already have your ultimate. You should only dynamite after the fight has began, and preferably when you used Bob already. This is because while you have Bob ready, your dynamite will contribute no ult charge to you at all, making it a waste. It's even more significant because the enemy supports will be able to immediately heal up the damage you've just done to their team, contributing a fair bit of ult charge to the enemy. This makes this a double whammy and means you should be very cautious of your dynamite timing. Again, if you don't have Bob, then sure, just let it fly. Speaking of, let's move on into Ashe's ultimate Bob, who is an absolute unit. When you use Bob, he goes charging out and hits enemies up into the air, dealing a whopping 120 damage to them and setting them up for easy follow-up headshots or just general damage like from Ashe's dynamite. He also has 1000 HP and acts as a teammate for the purpose of contesting objectives. Additionally, he deals 112 DPS, which makes him a fantastic damage dealer and, at times, the best teammate you have. The interesting thing about Bob is that Ashe is able to gain ult charge for another Bob while he is active and dealing damage, making the Bob dynamite combo a surprisingly effective one, since you can knock up a group of enemies and hit the dynamite on all of them, dealing a ton of surprise burst damage and gaining significant ult charge. As mentioned before, he also contests objectives, which can buy you and your team invaluable time to stabilize, or another word for heal up and get your resources back, and then come back into the fight without losing a bunch of players. He also buys you time to take shots and can create some space for you, as fighting an enemy Ashe with Bob shooting at you as well proves to be quite challenging. One of the most important tips for Bob, however, is to make sure that you aim him towards a wall instead of an enemy player. That way, if he misses or the enemy gets booped out of the way or something, Bob doesn't run off into the night and leave you alone fighting the enemy. Instead, what happens is he may miss the enemy, but when he collides with the wall, he will stop to turn and start firing. Overall, Bob is a fantastic ult, and your focus in every game should pretty much be looking to use Bob as soon as possible and continue building as many as you can over the course of each of your games. I have two final pieces of advice and tips that don't really warrant adding a whole new section, but I wanted to say them anyway as they help me a lot. When you are fighting an enemy tracer, use the hipfire to scope trick mentioned previously and save your dynamite for when she uses recall. Once you get good at it, you can actually predict roughly where she'll be coming out of recall, and you can hit her for a dynamite as soon as she comes out of it, dealing massive damage and making any follow-up fight she tries to take much easier on you. The other tip is to always be reloading whenever you aren't engaging someone actively. Ashe's weapon has a very slow reload where she can only load one bullet at a time, so minimize the time you spend needing to reload by reloading in those lulls or downtimes between fights, or when you are rotating from one position to another. Also try to make a habit of loading more than one shot at a time, even when fighting a 1v1, since constantly having to reload can throw off your aim, since you'll have to wait longer to make each adjustment shot. Reloading 3 to 4 bullets will make it so you can micro adjust more often and thus result in a higher percentage kill rate. That's going to be all for this video. Ashe is a pretty straightforward and powerful character, so I hope you walk away from this with some improvements on your Ashe gameplay and some new tips for getting the edge over your opponents. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Take care and peace.